November 11th, 1918. The armistice has come to pass. The war to end all wars has finally come to an end, after 4 years of bloody and unforgiving conflict that have scarred the bodies and the minds of those who were touched by the war. In the United States, the doughboys who went across the ocean to help bring Imperial Germany to the negotiating table at Versailles finally come home to celebration and fanfare. They won, and now it's time to move on with their lives. For some people, though, this task was harder than it was for others. How do you return to a normal life after experiencing the horrors of trench warfare? What do you do when you return to your home and try to go back to work and find the conditions you're put under are just as bad, if not worse, than the time you spent fighting in the trenches of Europe? For the people who lived in Logan County, West Virginia, and the surrounding counties, and the men who came home after serving their country during the First World War, this is what awaited them. I could go over and cover the entire subject, but today I want to focus on a single chapter in Logan County's turbulent history with the coal industry. Today we will be heading into the foothills and mountains of West Virginia to talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain. In 1890, the United Mine Workers Union was founded in hopes of giving the men who went deep into the earth to retrieve the necessary resources that American society required to progress had fair treatment from the owners and the operators of the mines that they went into. For the longest time, however, this wasn't the case for Logan County and the nearby surrounding counties as well, as the owners and operators of the mines in these areas strictly refused to hire anyone associated with the union, and set up employment contracts that listed membership of a union as a valid reason to be fired immediately. This was a pretty big deal given that a majority of miners in this time period lived nearly entirely in company towns. What's a company town, you ask? Well, what would happen is a mining company would buy the rights to the mines, but then they would buy the area surrounding the mines and build houses and open up stores and other things, and you could only live there if you worked in the mines. Another common practice that was used by coal executives and their ilk was the idea of not paying people who lived in these company towns real money. Instead, what they would do is they would give you a voucher or scrip to go to the company-owned stores and exchange them for goods and services that you needed done, essentially turning the coal miners and their families into serfs and peasants, due to them not having a way to make actual money and being forced to work under grueling and inhumane conditions lest the miners and their families be dragged out of their houses in the middle of the night with no chances to collect their items and personal belongings before being run out of town. This got so bad that tent colonies began spreading across the Tug Fork River, and the winters in West Virginia, they can be very unforgiving. There are currently no available numbers to give a solid conclusion over how many died during this practice and the resulting construction of these tent colonies, but given the time period and the frankly inhumane treatment miners experienced while they worked for the mine bosses, it's safe to assume that the number of lost lives by these practices range in hundreds at best and thousands at worst. When you think of a union, what comes to your mind? Is it people standing outside of a store, picketing and handing out pamphlets explaining why they're on strike? If so, then congratulations. You have some level of experience with how unions work and why they go on strike in the modern day. Unfortunately, however, during the 20s and 30s, the same protections that unions and their workers have today simply wasn't available due to the widespread corruption when it came to how the law was enforced unequally. For example, back to the picketers we discussed earlier. Today, they can picket and hand out their pamphlets and hold signs with union slogans on why they're on strike and what they're upset about. Unfortunately, back in the day, as a response to this, a lot of times what would happen is the bosses of the business that the workers had been going on strike for would call in strike breakers, professional thugs that specialized in using intimidation, bribery, and 9 times out of 10, physical violence to stop the strike from happening in the first place. One such group was the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. Now, you might be asking right now, Cecil, we're talking about thugs and people who should be labeled as criminals. Why are you bringing up this detective agency? What could they possibly have done? Aren't detectives supposed to be the good guys? You see, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency was founded as a company to help keep railroads safe. To keep people like Arthur Morgan and Dutch Vanderland from robbing a train. The problem was that as time passed, train robberies essentially stopped being an issue. So to make up for this, the founder of the company began offering their services to businesses and industrialists who were having issues with striking workers. And by 1920, the company had a reputation for using brutal and oppressive violence against people who wanted to organize a union. However, even with the threat of violence, the miners still decided to organize, following the lead of Mother Jones. 3,000 miners organized and joined the UMW, and were summarily fired. At which point the coal company sent out Baldwin-Felts to evict every single miner and their families. Following this, on May 19, 1920, the agents arrived in Matawan in Mingo County and attempted to bribe Mayor Cable Testerman with $500 or $7,605 in today's money to place machine gun positions on the roofs of the town, a proposition which, thankfully, Testerman refused. That afternoon, Albert Felts and Lee Felts, along with 11 other men, made their way to the Stone Mountain Coal Company properties and began the eviction process. The first family who was thrown out from their home was a woman and her children. The woman's husband was not at home at the time, and they forced them out of the house at gunpoint during a light but steady rain, after which they began throwing out all of their belongings into the mud and rain in front of the family. This unwarranted act of just sheer inhumane treatment did not go unnoticed, and the miners who witnessed the event sent word in anger to the town about what these detectives were doing. What happened next would be the spark that would ignite a multi-county war between the coal laborers and their oppressive coal barons. Albert and Lee Felts made their way back to the train station to leave town, at which point Police Chief Sid Hatfield, along with a group of deputized miners, approached them and announced that the Felts brothers, along with the rest of their agents, were all under arrest. Albert retorted that he, in fact, had an arrest warrant for Sid Hatfield. Mayor Testerman was alerted by the shouting and ran outside to go see what was going on. Hatfield went inside a store that was nearby, and Testerman asked Albert and Lee to see the warrant. After reviewing the document, he shouted at the two men, proclaiming that the warrant was in fact bogus. After hearing these words, a gunfight erupted in the streets, and Police Chief Sid Hatfield shot Albert Felts. A total of 10 men died in the ensuing gunfight, including Mayor Testerman, Albert Felts, and Lee Felts. The gunfight became known as the Matawan Massacre, and it was a significant boost of morale for the miners. The seemingly invincible detective agency had been defeated, and Chief Hatfield became a legend and a hero to the men who slaved away in the mines. He helped them realize that the oppression brought on by the coal barons and the hired guns that they kept at their disposal could now be deposed from their power. Random gunfights between Baldwin-Felts agents and miners took place along the Tug River, and in June 1920, the West Virginian State Police, under the authority of Captain Brockus, rode into the Lick Creek tent colony near Williamson. No one knows who fired the first shots, but the end result was horrific. The state police executed and arrested miners at random, destroyed their tents, tearing into the canvas and destroying the very thing necessary to help shelter the miners who lived there, and scattered the belongings of nearly everyone who lived in the colony. Both sides were on the warpath now, and Sid Hatfield continued to help add more fuel to the flame, turning the late Testerman's jewelry store into a firearms shop. The next year, on January 26, 1921, the trial of Sid Hatfield for the killing of Albert Felts began. This was in the national spotlight for a time and shone the light on the plight of the miners and what they were all fighting for. And Hatfield, for that matter, went from being just a local legend to a near mythical man. In the end, all men involved in the gunfight were acquitted, but the Union was facing severe setbacks. 80% of the mines had reopened in the area and used scabs from outside of the counties to get the mines to be fully operational once again. In mid-May 1921, the spark that had been lit by the Matawan massacre had finally reached the powder keg, and the Union miners led a full-scale assault on non-Union mines. In a short time, the conflict had set the entire Tug River Valley ablaze, until a truce was agreed and martial law was implemented. From the second the truce took effect and martial law was put into place, it was clear the game was rigged from the start. Hundreds of Union miners were arrested. The smallest of infractions, such as spitting on the street, could land you in jail, while those on the opposing side were essentially given blanket immunity. In response to this, the miners, many of whom were veterans who served in France as American soldiers during World War I, responded with guerrilla tactics and sabotage. During this time in American history, the trees spoke West Virginian.
Shit, I got jump scared. Ronan has Spectre Compact.
There's a third one back there.
Yeah, there's 2 teams over there.
Killed one.
And things were about to get worse. On August 1st, 1921, Sid Hatfield and his close friend Ed Chambers, along with their wives, made their way to the McDowell County Courthouse to stand trial for using dynamite to blow up a coal tipple, which you can see here. It's used to load minecarts, essentially. As they walked up the courthouse stairs, unarmed and with their wives at their sides, a group of Baldwin Felts agents standing at the top of the stairs opened fire. Hatfield was killed instantly, and Ed Chambers was struck by multiple bullets, falling down the stairs to the bottom, where an agent, despite Sally Chambers' pleas for her husband's life, shot Ed Chambers once again in the back of his head at point-blank range. Hatfield and Chambers' bodies were returned to Matawan, and the word of the assassination that took place in broad daylight spread like wildfire in the mountains. For the miners, enough was enough. They took up arms and began to come down from the tops of the mountains. The first instance of the escalation that took place was along the Little Coal River, where miners had begun to patrol and guard the area. Sheriff Don Chafin from Logan County sent men to go to the area, where they were immediately captured by the miners, disarmed, and caused them to flee from the area. At this point, the coal wars were getting to be too much of a problem for Governor Ephraim Morgan to ignore. And on August 7th, UMW District 17 leaders Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney approached the governor with a petition of the miners' demands. Morgan denied every single demand, which only served to anger the miners even further. At which point, talk began to spread of marching on Mingo to free the miners that had been arrested unjustly, end martial law, and organize the county under the Union. But Blair Mountain, Logan County, and Sheriff Chafin stood directly in front of them. 4 days later, miners began gathering at Lens Creek Mountain near Marmet in Kanawha County, and by August 24th, 13,000 miners and Union members had gathered and began their march towards Logan County and Blair Mountain. In order to get to the fighting faster, miners commandeered a Chesapeake and Ohio freight train to meet with the advance column of the marchers on their way to Logan County. By this point, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney had fled to Ohio. The leadership of the miners fell to one Bill Blizzard. While this was happening, the staunchly anti-Union Sheriff Chafin had begun to set up defenses on Blair Mountain, being financially supported by the Logan County Coal Operators Association, creating at the time the largest privately armed force of almost 2,000 men. On August 25th, the first skirmishes began to take place early in the morning, while a majority of the miners were still about 15 miles or 24 kilometers away from Blair Mountain. The next day, President Warren G. Harding threatened to send the army to the area as well as deploy bombers against the miners. However, for a moment, it seemed like the drastic course of action could be avoided. For you see, after a long meeting in Madison, the main town in Boone County, the miners were convinced to return home, which is great. No more bloodshed is necessary. Everyone can go home, and everything will be okay. This is, of course, where Chafin would go out of his way, under the assumed direction of his financial backers, to be an asshole. Within hours of the Madison decision, word began to spread amongst the miners that Chafin's men had executed Union sympathizers in the town of Sharples, just north of Blair Mountain, and that the families of the sympathizers had been caught in the crossfire of the ensuing skirmishes. Infuriated, the miners turned back towards Blair Mountain, many traveling in stolen or commandeered locomotives. By the time August 27th had come around, the battle for Blair Mountain was raging. Chafin, though he was severely outnumbered, possessed superior weapons and the advantage of defending the top of a mountain. Private planes were hired and used to drop homemade bombs, along with surplus poison gas and explosive bombs that were left over from World War I on the miners attempting to take the mountain. Several bombs were dropped in locations near the towns of Jeffrey, Sharples, and Blair, and at least one of these bombs did not explode. Keep this in mind, this is important for later. On the orders of General Billy Mitchell, Army bombers from Maryland were used for surveillance, and one of the bombers crashed on its return flight, killing 4 out of the 5 crew members that were on board. On August 30th, Governor Morgan, the man who could have prevented all this, sent in the West Virginia National Guard in hopes of breaking the resistance of the miners. For another week, small firefights broke out, with the miners at one point nearly breaking through into the town of Logan and their target destinations, the non-unionized Logan County and Mingo County. Gatling guns from the Civil War era and machine guns were used by both sides at this point to help bolster their firepower and prevent the other side from gaining an advantage. By September 2nd, federal troops had arrived to Blair Mountain, and given that many of the miners were veterans themselves, they refused to fire on U.S. soldiers. Bill Blizzard shortly afterward gave word to the miners that they should head home the following day. After the battle was finished, 985 miners were indicted on charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and treason against the state of West Virginia. A majority of the miners were acquitted by sympathetic jurors, but there was a considerable amount who were imprisoned for up to 4 years, with the last miner finally being let out on parole in 1925. At Bill Blizzard's trial, one unexploded bomb was brought forward as evidence of the brutality of the government and the coal companies as a whole, and due to this, Bill Blizzard was acquitted on all charges. So how did all this end? What was the point of all this? Unfortunately, in the short term, the battle was an overwhelming victory for the coal barons and their lackeys. UMW membership plummeted from over 50,000 members to under 10,000 over the next several years. And it wasn't until the Great Depression had already happened and FDR promised the New Deal that UMW fully organized in the southern counties of West Virginia. In the long term, however, the battle raised awareness of the inhumane conditions that the miners were forced to work in the West Virginia coal fields. It also led to unions changing their playbook, focusing on getting new laws put into place that would force the police and other entities meant to protect the people to actually do their job and hold the coal barons accountable for their mismanagement and the abuse of their workers. Today the mountain is quiet. The marks of the battle that took place 103 years ago, a distant memory, though still visible if you know where to look. The mountain has been registered as a national battlefield, and therefore protected from the coal barons of today, who would stop at nothing to erase the memory of a time when blue-collared workers stood up against them and only stopped because they chose to stop. The miners were never defeated. They fought as long as they wanted to, and when they saw that the fight was going to be against their own brothers in arms, they stopped and went home of their own accord. Thank you so much for watching this video. This one is longer than the one that I did previously, but I just kind of really got into the topic. Tune in next time to see me ramble with my steak expert friend, and we will talk about steak. Bye!